Bigfoot, the animal hidden in the pattern. Winter, 1969. Near the small town of Bossburg, Washington, strange footprints have been appearing in the snow. They are enormous, human-like, and one of the feet appears badly deformed. Then on December 13th, investigators find something much harder to ignore. A trackway, not 10 prints, not 50. More than 1,000 impressions running through the snow. And the strange deformity is still there. Step after step, the same foot, the same abnormal shape. The British primatologist John Napier later examined casts and photographs and believed the deformity resembled a genuine clubfoot pathology. Think about what that means. A person faking Bigfoot tracks needs to make a large foot. Someone faking this needs to invent an individual, a specific animal with a specific physical abnormality, carried consistently through an enormous sequence of tracks. There is a serious problem with Bossburg, and we will come back to it. But that tension is exactly why Bigfoot is still interesting. Because this is not really a story about one footprint, or one photograph, or one frightened witness in the woods. The real question is much larger. After we remove the obvious mistakes, the bears, the exaggerations and the hoaxes, is there still a pattern left? And if there is, what kind of animal does that pattern describe? Before we go any further, one disclaimer. The final number in this episode is not a scientifically calculated probability. It is my own assessment after weighing the evidence as a whole. Most individual Bigfoot reports are probably not Bigfoot. That is not controversial. People make mistakes. Animals are misidentified. Stories grow. Some people lie. The interesting question is whether those explanations can account for the entire phenomenon. Because once we stop looking at individual stories and begin looking at the structure behind them, something rather strange happens. An animal begins to appear. Today, everybody knows what Bigfoot is supposed to look like. Large, hairy, human-shaped, walking on two legs. That creates an enormous contamination problem. Someone who sees a black bear standing upright does not approach the experience with an empty mind. The image of Bigfoot already exists. So modern sightings alone can never answer this question. We have to go backwards. Before television, before the internet, before Patterson and Gimlin, before the word Bigfoot was even widely used. During the 19th century, newspapers across North America occasionally reported encounters with what they called wild men. Much of this material is terrible. Some stories were entertainment. Some were probably bears. Others may have involved hermits, fugitives, or simple invention. But scattered through that mess is a surprisingly persistent behavior. The creature notices the person. The person notices the creature. And then the creature leaves. It watches. It hesitates. It withdraws into cover. It is an oddly boring way to write a monster story. Nobody gets dragged into the forest. Nobody fights a giant ape under a full moon. The thing usually disappears. And that basic pattern exists long before modern Bigfoot culture. Indigenous traditions go much further back still. We have to be careful here. There is no single Native American Bigfoot tradition. Different peoples describe different beings with different meanings. Some were physical, some spiritual. Some belong to religious traditions that should not be reduced to cryptozoology. But there are also traditions involving large, human-like beings associated with forests, mountains, and remote wilderness. That does not prove Bigfoot. It does tell us that the idea of a human-like wilderness inhabitant did not begin with a camera in 1967. And when we move into the modern sighting record, the pattern becomes more detailed. In 2020, researchers analyzed a large collection of North American reports concerning an alleged unknown hominoid. Instead of selecting only the spectacular encounters, they coded the reports across 78 characteristics involving appearance, environment, behavior, and tracks. 36 characteristics stood out statistically. Among them were avoidance and flight behavior. And this is where Bigfoot becomes more interesting than a collection of spooky stories, because the animal described in those reports behaves in a surprisingly consistent way. It does not normally attack people. It does not behave like a movie monster. It avoids, it watches, it retreats. And sometimes when people continue approaching, the behavior changes. Branches break, vegetation moves, vocalizations begin. Objects are reported landing near camps or striking trees. There are accounts of rapid approaches that stop before physical contact. Bluff charges, not an attack. A warning. Put these reports together and something begins to resemble an ethogram, a behavioral profile. Detect, observe, stay covered. If discovered, withdraw. If the human keeps coming, intimidate. Avoid contact if possible. That is a remarkably sensible behavioral strategy for a large intelligent animal sharing its habitat with humans. Known great apes offer useful comparisons. Wild gorillas use elaborate threat displays. Cross-river gorillas have even been documented throwing vegetation and, in one case, a detached branch toward humans during display behavior. That does not prove anything about Bigfoot, but it does show that the reported behavior makes biological sense. And there is something else. If we had invented Bigfoot purely as a monster, this is not necessarily the animal we would invent. We would make it aggressive, dramatic, dangerous. Instead, the creature in many reports seems almost obsessed with controlling distance. It wants to know where we are, without letting us know exactly where it is. And suddenly one of the oldest objections changes. If Bigfoot exists, why don't we see it? Start with the animal described by the reports. Low population density, large home range, excellent hearing, excellent vision, intelligent, familiar with its environment, primarily living in forest, and apparently extremely reluctant to approach humans. Now place that animal in Western North America. British Columbia alone contains enormous areas of mountain and forest with very little permanent human presence. Add Alaska, the Canadian interior, Washington, Oregon, Northern California. From a road, wilderness can look small. Walk away from that road and the scale changes very quickly. Ridges block sight lines, vegetation becomes dense, human noise carries. An animal that lives there does not need supernatural powers to avoid us. It only has to detect us before we detect it. And if the reports are even approximately correct, that is exactly what it appears to do. There are also seasonal and geographic patterns in sightings. I would be cautious about calling them proven migration routes. We do not have enough evidence for that. But the possibility of large seasonal movements or extremely large individual ranges would fit the animal being described. It would also make permanent hotspots less likely. And that is important. A low-density animal moving over huge distances does not behave like a population of deer living behind someone's garden. There is, however, a major problem with the geography. Black bears. When researchers modeled the ecological distribution of Bigfoot sightings, the resulting range looked surprisingly coherent. The problem was that it also overlapped extremely well with black bear habitat. That is not something we should explain away. Bears almost certainly account for many Bigfoot reports. A bear can stand on two legs. At distance, it can look strangely human. Bear tracks can overlap and produce elongated impressions. A dark bear moving through woodland for 3 seconds can become almost anything in human memory. So yes, bears matter, a lot, but they become less comfortable as an explanation when encounters are longer, closer, and more detailed. Shoulders, arms, hands, leg proportions, a human-like gait, a face, and especially the feet. A single giant footprint means almost nothing. People have been making fake Bigfoot feet for decades. The interesting evidence begins when a footprint becomes a trackway. Now the fake has to move. Terrain changes, the foot lands differently, the toes shift, weight moves forward, the animal turns and it slips, it climbs. One print is deep, the next barely registers. That is much harder to fake convincingly over hundreds of steps. At Blue Creek Mountain in 1967, investigators counted close to 600 surviving impressions after some of the trackway had already been disturbed. And then came Bossberg, more than 1,000 tracks, including the deformed foot. Now we have to deal with the problem I promised you at the beginning. Even Marks was closely involved in the Bossberg investigation. He later produced supposed Bigfoot footage that investigators concluded had been faked. That badly damages Bossberg. There is no clever way around it. Once someone connected to evidence is associated with later hoaxing, confidence in anything surrounding that person has to fall. So Bossberg cannot carry the Bigfoot case. But something about it remains interesting. The alleged hoax contained complexity that the hoax did not need. a consistent deformity, repeated through a huge sequence of tracks. Anatomical detail good enough to attract the attention of a professional primatologist. Possible to fake? Absolutely, but far stranger than a pair of plywood feet. And Bossberg is not the only place where footprint anatomy becomes unusual. The human foot is relatively rigid through its middle. Our arch helps create an efficient lever during walking and running. Other apes retain much more flexibility through the midfoot. Some alleged Sasquatch tracks appear to show something similar. A broad, relatively flat foot, large heel, flexible middle, pressure ridges forming as the foot bends during movement, partial prints where the front of the foot appears to load differently from the heel. This is usually described as a mid-tarsal break. The important part is not one dramatic cast. It is the way some trackways vary, toe positions change, pressure changes, the foot slips, turns alter the print. The impressions behave less like stamps and more like the record of a moving limb. That does not make them genuine. A sophisticated hoaxer can build flexible feet, but every additional dynamic feature increases the complexity of the hoax. And when similar characteristics appear in track evidence separated by time and location, they become harder to dismiss with one simple explanation. Dermal ridges are different. Tiny ridge patterns have been reported in some casts and were once presented as powerful evidence. I give them very little weight. Experiments have shown that the casting process itself can produce ridge-like structures in certain substrates. Unless those ridges are clearly documented in the original print before casting, they do not tell us much. We do not need them. The larger question is whether the anatomy and movement in the better trackways form a consistent pattern. And frustratingly, sometimes they do. Then there are the nests. Every living non-human great ape builds sleeping nests. Chimpanzees do it. Gorillas do it. Orangutans do it. Ground nests are entirely normal in gorillas. Researchers in the Pacific Northwest have documented large structures made from bent and woven vegetation that they believe may represent Sasquatch sleeping sites. Nobody has demonstrated that a Sasquatch built them. That needs to be said once. Bears make beds. Deer flatten vegetation. People build shelters. Forests create strange structures on their own. But if Bigfoot really is a large North American hominoid, nest building is exactly the sort of behavior we would expect. And that makes these sites useful for a reason that has nothing to do with belief. They give us somewhere to test. Find a fresh structure, secure it, control contamination. Take hair, take soil, take saliva if possible, collect environmental DNA, and send it to independent laboratories. Because eventually, every Bigfoot discussion reaches the same wall. Biology. If Bigfoot exists, it leaves DNA. It has no choice. It loses hair. It sheds skin cells. It drinks. It eats. It urinates. It defecates. It bleeds. It dies. In 2014, Brian Sykes and colleagues carried out a systematic genetic analysis of hair submitted as possible evidence for Bigfoot, Yeti, and other anomalous primates. 37 selected samples went forward for genetic testing. 7 failed to produce a usable sequence despite repeated attempts. The remaining 30 were identified. They came from known mammals. No unknown North American primate appeared. That is serious negative evidence. But it is often described incorrectly. Scientists did not systematically sample the wilderness and prove that no unknown primate DNA exists there. They tested alleged cryptid hair submitted to them. The hair they successfully identified was not Bigfoot. That distinction matters. There have also been samples described over the years as degraded, contaminated, inconclusive, or unidentified. Those words are not evidence of Bigfoot either. Unknown does not mean unknown ape. Sometimes it simply means bad sample. The standard we need is actually very simple. A clean sample. Good chain of custody. Unknown primate DNA. Independent replication. That would change this entire subject overnight. And after all these years, we still do not have it. That is the strongest argument against Bigfoot. Not that eyewitnesses are stupid. Not that forests are completely explored. Not that a bear can stand up. The strongest argument is that a breeding population of large mammals should eventually leave something biological that survives scrutiny. And so far, it has not. There are also persistent stories involving government agencies, wildlife officers, Police, military personnel, bodies removed from roads, witnesses being told not to speak. Some of those stories are intriguing. None of them is strong enough to carry the case. But it would also be wrong to pretend government agencies have never touched the subject. In 1976, alleged Bigfoot hair was submitted to the FBI. The laboratory reported back in February 1977 that it came from the deer family. That is not a cover-up. It is simply a documented example of a federal agency examining alleged evidence. Could other material or incidents have been handled differently? Of course. Governments keep things secret all the time. Wildlife agencies also sometimes manage sensitive information about endangered animals, dangerous animals, and active investigations. But until there is a document, a specimen, or a verifiable chain of events, government suppression remains a possibility, not evidence. And Bigfoot does not need it to remain interesting. The rest of the pattern is strange enough, because North America is not alone. The Himalayas have the Yeti. Central Asia and the Caucasus have traditions of wild human-like beings, often grouped under names such as Almasty. China has the Yeren. Sumatra has the smaller Orang Pendek. Australia has the Yowie. These are not all the same creature. They are not even necessarily the same type of phenomenon. But across widely separated cultures and regions, humans repeatedly describe something human-like living beyond the edge of settlement. There are two broad ways to interpret that. The first is cultural. Perhaps humans naturally invent the wild man, the creature outside civilization, a reflection of ourselves without language, cities, or rules. That idea is ancient and widespread. It may explain a great deal, but there is another possibility. For most of our evolutionary history, we were not alone. Homo sapiens shared the world with other human forms, Neanderthals, Denisovans, Homo floresiensis, others whose traces we are still trying to understand. Our family tree was never a clean line leading neatly to us. It was crowded. Branches overlapped. Populations met, interbred, disappeared. So the general idea of another human-like species surviving beside us is not biologically absurd. Whether one survived into modern North America is a completely different question. But it is not the ridiculous question it might once have seemed. And now we can finally step back. Forget the famous film. Forget the best witness. Forget the worst hoax. Forget the argument that has been repeated 10,000 times. Take the reports as a population of data. Take the older traditions. Take the historical sightings. Take the behavior. Take the geography. Take the possible seasonal movement. Take the long trackways. Take the recurring foot anatomy. Take the possible nest building behavior. Take the failed DNA searches. Lay everything on top of everything else, and something begins to emerge. A very large terrestrial hominoid, bipedal, broad-bodied, equipped with a large flexible foot, living mainly in heavily forested terrain, occurring at low population density, possibly traveling across very large ranges, extremely alert, intelligent, curious enough to watch people, cautious enough to avoid them, more willing to intimidate than attack, potentially building sleeping sites, and behaviorally almost perfectly suited to remaining difficult to observe. That animal may not exist. Bears can explain part of the pattern. Hoaxes can explain part. Folklore can explain part. Human perception can explain part. Memory can explain part. The challenge for the conventional explanation is that all of those mechanisms have to combine repeatedly to produce approximately the same creature. The biological explanation is much simpler. There is an animal, but simplicity is not proof. And the biological explanation carries one enormous burden that it still has not overcome. Where is the biology? After more than a century of reports, we still have no authenticated body, no accepted bone, no tooth, no tissue, no genome. Low population density helps explain that. Huge habitat helps. Long-range movement helps. Intelligence helps. Avoidance helps. None of them makes the problem disappear. If Bigfoot exists, eventually biology should catch it. Probably not with a hunter. Possibly not even with a camera. It may happen with a water sample, a hair trapped under bark, skin cells left on vegetation, faces beside a feeding site, environmental DNA collected from a mountain stream. The final proof of Bigfoot may turn out to be one of the least dramatic moments in the entire history of the subject, a genetic sequence appearing on a computer screen. Until that happens, we have the pattern. And when I put the historical reports, witness convergence, behavioral consistency, geography, footprint anatomy, long trackways, possible nests, and the long, messy history of biological samples together, I cannot honestly reduce the entire thing to nothing. There is too much structure for me to be comfortable doing that. Not enough to declare a new species, not enough to say the mystery is solved, but enough that I think a real biological explanation deserves to be taken seriously. So my final assessment is 60-40, a 60% chance that a real, unknown biological animal lies behind the core Bigfoot phenomenon, a 40% chance that known animals, human error, folklore, hoaxing, and cultural reinforcement can ultimately account for the entire pattern. And that number is allowed to move. Find a clean, unknown primate genome tomorrow, and 60 becomes much higher. Carry out large, properly designed environmental DNA surveys across the strongest habitats and repeatedly find nothing, and 60 falls. Show that the supposedly independent behaviors and anatomical details only begin appearing after they become popular within Bigfoot culture, and the entire argument takes a serious hit. That is how it should work, because the interesting position is not believing in Bigfoot no matter what, and it is not dismissing Bigfoot no matter what. It is admitting that the evidence has created a genuine problem. After thousands of sightings, after more than a century of searching, after footprints, tracks, nests, recordings, and samples, there is still no clean answer. And somewhere between the people who know Bigfoot exists and the people who know that it cannot, there is a much more interesting possibility we simply do not know yet. But if the pattern means